Hi, my name is Stephanie Hertz. I'm the Marketing Director here at Workforce Retirement Community. I'm sitting in our Poplar Deluxe, a 2-bedroom cottage here on our campus. It's currently move-in ready and we'd love to take you for a tour. Today, I'm introducing 2 people who played an integral role in Riverside Health System's fight against COVID-19. Dr. Koehl is the System Director of Clinical Pharmacy Services for Riverside Health System, with accountability for clinical pharmacy across 5 acute care hospitals, 6 lifelong health facilities, and a 600-member medical group. She received her Bachelor of Science in Biology from Christopher Newport University and a Doctor of Pharmacy from Virginia Commonwealth University. She completed her residency at Riverside Regional Medical Center. Dr. Koehl is board certified in both pharmacotherapy and nutrition support and has been with Riverside since 2002. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Koehl has been coordinating the clinical pharmacy response for Riverside Health System. This includes reviewing medical literature for new treatment options, ensuring hospitals have supplies of critical medications, and providing education on COVID treatments to pharmacists, nurses, and providers. For this work, as well as a long history of professional and community volunteerism, Dr. Koehl was named Pharmacist of the Year by the Virginia Society of Health System Pharmacists for 2020. Registered pharmacist Cindy Williams received her BS Pharmacy from Virginia Commonwealth University. She has completed the Executive Management Program for Pharmacy Leaders at the Wharton School and the Pharmacy Leadership Institute at Boston University. Cindy currently serves as the VP Chief Pharmacy Officer for Riverside Health System in Newport News, Virginia. In this role, she is responsible for oversight of pharmacy practice and medication management for the acute care and post-acute care facilities, as well as a 600-member medical group. Over the last year, Cindy has led Riverside's medication-related COVID-19 response, including leadership of the COVID-19 Vaccine Initiative. She has been a member of the Virginia Department of Health COVID-19 Vaccine Committee, including membership on the Vaccine Safety and Efficacy subgroup. Cindy has also held a leadership role in the Vaccinate the Peninsula initiative. From a professional organizational standpoint, Cindy has served on the ASHP Council on Pharmacy Management and several on the ASHP Section Advisory subgroups. She is a past board member at large, House of Delegates member, and president of Virginia Society of Health System Pharmacists. Cindy is the recipient of the Virginia Society of Health System Pharmacists R.D. Anderson Pharmacy Leadership Award, the American Society of Health System Pharmacists Distinguished Service Award, and holds fellow status with American Society of Health System Pharmacists. She holds adjunct faculty positions at Virginia Commonwealth University and Hampton University School of Pharmacy, and has completed certification programs in diabetes management and medication therapy management. Without further ado, please enjoy the lecture.
Good morning, everybody. I am Kathy Koehl. I'm here with Cindy Williams, and we're very excited to be with you to talk about COVID-19 vaccines, the path that we've taken to get here, what the current state is, and what the future looks like for these vaccines. So today we're going to talk about the background on vaccine development and approval process in the U.S. And then we're going to specifically dive into the COVID-19 vaccine. We're going to talk about how that vaccine was developed and approved, what our experiences have been so far, how the vaccines appear to be performing against emerging variants, as well as the ongoing clinical trials to assess the performance of these vaccines. So just about vaccines in general, how they're approved, how they're manufactured. There's a multi-step process that the FDA requires to gather evidence for these vaccines. So in a phase 1 trial, this is where we're going to start with a small group of healthy adult volunteers. We're going to administer the vaccine to those individuals with the goal of determining if the vaccine itself is safe. Does it work? Does it prevent the disease that we're intending to protect the population from? What are the side effects of this vaccine, and are they tolerable? And then can we understand the relationship between the dose of the vaccine given to those individuals and the severity or the effect of those side effects? If we get acceptable data from that first vaccine and we've determined that it's safe to proceed, we'll move into a phase 2 study. With a phase 2 study, we'll move into a larger group of adult volunteers, probably several hundred. We'll still continue to look for adverse events. What's the frequency of those adverse events in that population? And then what's the immune response from those volunteers? Can we collect data on how, what the level of antibodies that the individuals produce? Again, if that vaccine appears to be safe and efficacious, we'll move on to a larger scale study called a phase 3 study. Within that phase 3 study, we'll have hundreds or thousands even of adult volunteers. And we'll look at how those individuals who received the vaccine do as compared to those who did not. So those who received the placebo. Is the incidence of the disease higher in the group that got the placebo as compared to those who received the vaccine? Again, we're always looking for those safety signals. Is the vaccine safe? Does it appear to be effective? And what are the most common side effects? After we have that entirety of data, it can be submitted to the FDA for review. The FDA will review and approve that vaccine only if it appears to be both safe and effective, and the benefits of receiving the vaccine appear to outweigh the risks of receiving the vaccine. Only when that is completed, the manufacturer of the vaccine can start to produce the vaccine on a large scale. When the vaccine is made in large scale, so it's made in batches called lots, the manufacturer has to do extensive testing on each lot of the vaccine and submit that information to the FDA. And only once the FDA has reviewed that data and said that the vaccine that they're producing is safe, it's pure and potent, then it can be released into the population to be available for vaccination. The FDA does always inspect these facilities on a routine basis to make sure that they are following safe manufacturing processes. So once a vaccine is available for administration, there's an entire separate process to review it and determine whether or not it should be added to the immunization schedule, whether it's the immunization schedule for adults in the United States or for children in the United States. So there's a committee called the ACIP, or the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. This body is a group of medical professionals and public health experts, and they will take the opinions of multiple outside groups who have reviewed the data on individual vaccines. These can be the American Academy of Family Physicians or the American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as other groups. They will take those recommendations as well as all the information from the clinical trials and determine who should receive the vaccine and when. So they'll look at what's the most appropriate age for an individual to receive the vaccine, how well does it work in that population, how serious is the disease that it prevents, and what's the impact on the individual at that particular age, and how many when we're looking at children in particular, how many children might receive that or might be exposed to and be infected with that disease if the vaccine was not available. Once the ACIP makes their recommendations, those recommendations have to be approved by the CDC director before they can be added to the official vaccine schedule for adults or children in the United States. So once a vaccine has been approved by the FDA and then recommended by the ACIP and added to the official schedule, the work does not end there. We will continue to monitor the safety of vaccines go forward. And there's multiple groups that do this on the behalf of the FDA and the CDC. The most common you may have heard of with the COVID-19 vaccine is the VAERS system, or the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. This system, this group collects the data from any adverse events that are reported related to the vaccine, and then tries to find commonalities between those events to see if there are any safety concerns that require continual review. If they did find anything, they would escalate it to the FDA or the CDC. Similarly, there's the Vaccine Safety Data Link and the Post-Licensure Rapid Immunization Safety Monitoring program called PRISM. These are two networks of healthcare organizations across the United States that collect data from millions of individuals, and then they can again look for those safety concerns or signals and then report those back up to the FDA and the CDC. Lastly, there's the Clinical Immunization Safety Assessment Project. That is a collaboration between the CDC and 7 medical research centers that continue to do clinical trials on vaccine efficacy, looking for any safety concerns. Again, if those safety concerns are elevated to the FDA and the CDC, they can they can review the entirety of that data and decide how we go forward, whether the vaccine is still approved for use, whether it needs to be paused or discontinued, or if we need to provide additional patient and healthcare provider education around those concerns with the vaccine. So there's a couple different approval pathways that vaccines can go through. So we're going to talk about the difference between an EUA, or an emergency use authorization, and a full FDA approval. So an emergency use authorization is a conditional approval that's based on at least 2 months of safety data. So a shorter term of data, and it has to be done in the setting of an emergency situation. So something like a global pandemic would certainly qualify. We compare this to a full approval or a biologic license application, which is going to require at least 6 months of data for approval. So let's talk about the COVID-19 vaccines that are approved or still in the pipeline. The coronavirus is uniquely positioned to be a great candidate for vaccine because of the unique aspects of a coronavirus. So we're all very familiar with the image of the coronavirus. It's a sphere with these spiky with these spike proteins that come from the surface of the virus, and those spike proteins are a great target for vaccine development. So with an mRNA vaccine or a messenger RNA vaccine, what we can do is take the genetic instructions that just make the spike protein on the virus, so not the virus itself, just these spike proteins. We can formulate them into a vaccine that we would then inject into an individual. Their immune system would take up the portion of the messenger RNA that codes for just that spike protein, take it into the cells, and then use the normal manufacturing processes of the cell to create that spike protein. Once the cell has read that information, it gets rid of that mRNA through its normal cellular processes. So it doesn't incorporate into your DNA or stay in your body after that protein is made. Those spike proteins then migrate to the surface of the host cell, and then the immune system goes through its normal processes of recognizing something that would be non-self, and then can create antibodies so that it will recognize that spike protein if it ever sees it again. So this allows the individual to have protection from the virus without ever having to have exposure to the disease or infection to the disease itself. We do see very often that people will start to show symptoms of immune activation when they're given a vaccine. So after vaccination, you may have a mild fever, chills, headache. These are very common reactions and should be seen as a good sign that the immune system has recognized that foreign protein and started to go through its normal processes to create an antibody response. Slightly different, but still very similar, we have viral vector vaccines, and these work in a similar way, but they use a non-harmful virus to help get that spike protein into the cell. So they use different types of non-harmful viruses to help that information get into the cell. Again, to have the cell manufacture those spike proteins just as it would with the mRNA vaccine. They go to the surface of the cell, and then the immune system recognizes them and starts to create antibodies. It again gives great protection, but we cannot get COVID-19 from either one of these vaccines, and you also cannot get an infection from the virus that we're using to facilitate entry of the spike protein information into the cell. We do expect that people have a very similar immune reaction to this type of vaccine also. So again, fever, chills, headache are very common after administration of these types of vaccines, and often common after administration of a lot of our different vaccines. So here is a timeline of the different vaccines that are in process that are available in different parts of the world. We're going to focus on the Moderna vaccine, the Pfizer biotech vaccine, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So to start with the Pfizer vaccine is a messenger RNA vaccine that is available in the United States. When we look at the timeline for this vaccine, Pfizer did partner with a small biotech company called BioNTech early in the pandemic to start to produce a vaccine for public use. They did start with volunteers in Germany back in April of 2020 to start with the vaccine testing, but in May of 2020, the first volunteer in the United States was administered the Pfizer vaccine. In July, we were able to see the data on this vaccine for the first time, and then late in July, we moved into phase 2 and 3 studies. In November, we had access to the full phase 3 study, so that larger scale study of individuals. And we saw that the information that was gathered from that study was extremely positive. So in December, the vaccine was authorized in the United States, and very quickly after that, we had access to that vaccine for our populations. Just a little over a week later, it was authorized in the EU. After making the vaccine available to the initial population, the Pfizer vaccine was initially approved in individuals 16 years of age and older. They did start studying in younger populations. So in March of this year, the first study in children began. And very quickly after that, we started to see positive data announced in our young teens, so our 12 to 15-year-old population. In May, they submitted, Pfizer and BioNTech submitted their entirety of data to the FDA to ask for a full approval instead of operation under an EUA. And on that same day, they requested authorization under EUA for that young teen population, the 12 to 15-year-old approval, and that was received. The Pfizer vaccine is, again, approved now for those 12 years of age and older. It's a 2-dose series. Vaccines given on the first day and then given a second dose 21 days later. It's a bit of a challenge initially when we were given this vaccine because it does require ultra cold storage. So it requires storage at temperatures much below what we typically use in healthcare. And it did make the supply chain a bit of a challenge for smaller facilities because they just don't have access to this level of cold storage. So initially when this vaccine was released, really focused heavily on healthcare systems to help get that vaccine to our different populations. The second vaccine we'll discuss is the Moderna vaccine. It's also an mRNA vaccine. And Moderna started their process very early. In January of 2020, the vaccine candidate that they were going to move forward with was selected. And in March, they gave their first dose to their first phase 1 study patient. In May, we had phase 1 data that was disclosed, and later in May, we moved into the phase 2 studies. In July, we started the phase 3 studies, and in August, we were able to see some data around older adults in particular. Later in November, we had the full phase 3 study results disclosed, and they were extremely positive, which led to the FDA allowing this under EUA in December. In January, it was approved in the EU and then in the UK. In March, they started looking at variant-specific booster doses to accommodate some of the variants of COVID that were emerging globally. They also that month started their phase 3 study in children. The Moderna vaccine initially has been approved for those 18 years of age and older. So they started looking at pediatric populations, focusing on the 12 to 17-year-old population. They also changed their strategy a little bit around providing vaccine. They moved their manufacturing from a 10 dose per vial strategy to a 15 dose per vial strategy, trying to increase the amount of vaccine that was going to be available to the public. In May, they let us know that there was good data in the young teen population, and in June, they applied for full approval for the adult population to the FDA. So it would no longer, so they're asking to no longer be under EUA. And then just yesterday, they did file an EUA for the 12 to 17-year-old population based on their positive data. The Moderna vaccine, again, is for those 18 years of age and up currently. It is a 2-dose series where the first dose is given on day 1, and then we give a second dose 28 days later. It does not require the ultra cold storage. It requires regular freezer storage. So it's a little more accessible to different locations. And for the last vaccine that's currently available in the United States, it's the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It's a different vaccine type. It is a viral vector vaccine, so a little bit different than Moderna and Pfizer. And this vaccine candidate was selected in March of 2020, with the first volunteer receiving vaccine in July. The phase 3 study started in September with data disclosure soon after that. In October of 2020, they did pause their vaccinations due to a safety review. However, within just a little over a week, they determined they were safe to continue. So it's good that those feedback loops were being used to consider the safety of those in the clinical trials. In January, we had the results from that study, again, very positive. And then in February, we saw authorizations in Bahrain and the United States. In April, however, after the vaccine had been available in the United States for a little over a month, we did have a pause because we were starting to see safety signals around blood clots. The very unusual type of blood clot that occurred in the brain that was also associated with patients having low platelets. So based on that, the FDA and CDC decided to pause vaccine administrations while they could collect further data on these types of incidents and determine whether or not they were at all related to the vaccine. Similarly, the EMA found a possible link to a rare blood clotting syndrome at that same time in April. But after reviewing that data, they did clear the vaccine for use again, so it is actively used. But they did update their patient information so that individuals can make a really important decision about whether or not this is the correct vaccine for them to receive. We did see the blood clots more common in younger females, mostly of reproductive age. So each individual person can have that shared decision making with their provider as to whether or not this is a good vaccine for them. It's licensed for those who are 18 years of age and older, and it's the only available single-dose vaccine. So there are a lot of advantages for those who might want a single-dose vaccine versus a two-dose series. So if you've got folks who have vaccine fear, vaccine hesitancy, they're concerned about the side effects associated with second-dose vaccines, this might be a very attractive option for those individuals, especially for those who are very that may not have permanent residence, for those who may struggle to find a location to have a second dose administered. So the FDA and the CDC did decide that this is an important option to keep available to the public with appropriate education. And then in May, it was approved in the UK. So a few other vaccines of interest. None of these are currently available in the United States, but they're available in other places in the world. We have a viral vector vaccine from the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca. This one has also seen some safety concerns related to blood clotting, even though they use very different viral vectors than the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, but we continue to monitor to see if there's any similarities between the events happening with those two vaccines. There's also the Novavax and the Sanofi or GlaxoSmithKline vaccines. These are both protein-based vaccines. And then Merck did have a viral vector vaccine, but they just recently announced they're abandoning that vaccine, and they're going to change their focus to helping existing companies produce their vaccines. So most importantly, when we're considering these vaccines, we want to see if they're safe and effective. And so we're going to focus here on how effective these vaccines are. So this is the data, the comparative data of the available vaccines worldwide based on their phase 3 clinical trial data. So we're still looking at data within a clinical trial, which means we may have a defined population of individuals who are mostly healthy, are not, do not have significant disease. So we do want to see how it performs in that population. The Pfizer vaccine, again, the first one that was available to us, had a very high rate of prevention of symptomatic COVID at 95%. I want you to know that that's really remarkable for a vaccine. In any given year, our flu vaccine typically gives between 20 and 40% protection from symptomatic flu. So for this to give us 95% protection from symptomatic COVID is really remarkable. Similarly, Moderna had a 94.1% prevention of symptomatic COVID in their clinical trial data. Johnson & Johnson had a 66.9% protection from symptomatic COVID, which may seem much less than the other two vaccines. We'll remember that the FDA for approval did require that at least a vaccine would produce a 50% protection from symptomatic COVID-19. But this doesn't really tell the full story. When we look at protecting folks from COVID, of course we want to protect them from having symptomatic COVID, but we're also concerned about whether or not an individual gets sick enough that they need to be hospitalized or is so ill that they ultimately succumb to the disease and pass. So when we look at that endpoint for Johnson & Johnson, we're actually higher up into the 88th percentile of protection from hospitalization or death. So it really is a great vaccine, even though it might not confer as great of a protection against symptomatic COVID. All right, and from here, I'm going to pass it on to Cindy Williams.
Kathy, thank you so much for giving us great background information on the development of vaccines in the U.S. as well as where we are. I want to take a moment just to remind everyone, if you do have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat feature and we will make every attempt to answer those at the end of the conversation. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about where are we today related to vaccination status. And so this is a graphic that shows vaccine status, or the uptake of vaccines, and those individuals that have received at least one dose of vaccine in different parts of the world. And you can see the fifth down is United States. And so we're doing fairly well. Obviously, we would like to be doing better, and I think everyone's aware that President Biden, as well as Governor Northam, have announced that as a country and as a state, our goal is to have 70% of those age 18 and above receive at least one vaccine by July 4th. And so we're making good progress, but we're still not quite where we need to be at this point. You can see where some other parts of the world and where they're performing. I think we're all aware that Israel took a very aggressive stance, but even with that, they've sort of tapped out, if you will, in just over 60% based on this data. And then you see many other parts of the world that are lagging behind. And I think that's one of the concerns as we get into the discussion with variants, is that while the US and some other countries seem to be doing well, we have a lot of disparity across the world in access to vaccines currently. So when we start looking at vaccination status in the United States, this gives you a number of different statistical points. And as we go through slides around Virginia and the Virginia Peninsula, we will be looking at vaccine status in different ways. And so I'll draw your attention on the US stats, and this was from a little bit earlier this week, really looking at those that are 18 and above that have been vaccinated, as well as those that are 12 and above, because we'll be talking through both of those statistics related to the state of Virginia as well as the Virginia Peninsula in the next few slides. I think also of interest is if you look in the graphic on the right-hand side of the slide, there's information around which vaccines are being administered in the US. And I think it's no surprise that Pfizer's a little bit ahead of Moderna at this point. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Pfizer was approved a little bit earlier than Moderna in the process, and they also had greater manufacturing capacity early on, which allowed a larger amount of Pfizer to be available in the marketplace. Most recently, as Kathy went over in her data, is that Pfizer has now been approved for those 12 and above for about a month now. And so we are starting to see some uptake in those populations as local municipalities are looking to offer vaccine to their school-age children before they leave for the summer. Locally, there have been clinics in each of our jurisdictions that have offered vaccine to our school-age students 12 and above with the hope of at least getting a single vaccine administered before they go on summer break. Next in line is Moderna. Again, it has been approved since December. It is well tolerated. There has been good uptake. It is a little bit friendlier from a storage perspective, but recall they've only had approval for those 18 and above, so they've not really been able to be used in that group under 18, whereas Pfizer initially had 16 and above and now has 12 and above. And then you can see the lowest amount in the US is the Johnson & Johnson. Of course, that was not approved until towards the end of the first quarter, and then shortly thereafter had the pause. And as a result of that, and the fact that there are other viable options in the marketplace, the Johnson & Johnson just has not gained as much traction in the US. And I'm sure if you stay abreast of COVID news, maybe not the same way that Kathy and I do on a daily basis, but there's been a lot of discussion over the last week about the number of J&J doses sitting in refrigerators across the US that were scheduled to expire this month. And again, just yesterday, the FDA did grant additional stability to that Johnson & Johnson vaccine that should give us expiration dates rather than in June, sometime in the latter part of July or August. So we're essentially getting an additional 6 weeks at this point in which to use those vaccines, and they will still be considered to be effective. So let's now drill down to the next level, which is the current vaccination status of Virginia. And if you are interested in this type of data, this comes directly off of the VDH COVID-19 vaccine website. They do have a number of different types of data that you can slice and dice. This was pulled down just this morning, and so this does reflect data through yesterday around midday. And as you can see, Virginia as a state, 56.4% of the entire population has received at least one dose. But if we're really focusing in on that July 4th goal that has been set at the federal and state level, we're actually getting close to that 70%. As of this morning, we're at 68.5%. So, you know, we are starting to close in on that number. I will say, though, that, you know, many adults that are interested in getting vaccinated at this point have already been vaccinated. So closing that gap for that last 1.5% is not an easy task. And there are a number of efforts that are underway locally as well as at the state level to get that vaccination rate up to 70%. From a position within the US right now, Virginia sits at number 17 related to percentage of population that have received at least one dose of vaccine. We've been in that range for the last few days. So again, well above average. We'd certainly like to be in a better situation, and we're hoping that activities such as this will provide factual information that individuals can make good decisions around their vaccine choice. So let's talk a little bit more about what's happening locally. So some of you may be aware, but many of you may not be, that there is a large community collaboration that was formed several months ago that is called Vaccinate the Virginia Peninsula. And this group brings together the local municipalities, the local health systems, the Virginia Department of Health, and other key stakeholders to look at what we need to do as a region to ensure that we are offering vaccine regardless of, you know, location, socioeconomic class, that we are providing good information for individuals to make decisions around, and that we're really making sure that we're tracking that progress. And so one of the challenges, quite honestly, that we have had locally is we do have a large number of military individuals, and their reporting does not roll up at the local level in the state numbers. And so we've had to do some data analytics to capture what we believe the Department of Defense, the VA, et cetera, are contributing to this region from a vaccination status. And so here you will see two different columns. The column on the left is just the raw data that's pulled down from the Virginia Department of Health for our region. So again, this does not include anything from Department of Defense. And this is for individuals 12 years of age and older. We updated the metric a couple of weeks ago when the Pfizer was approved for that younger age group. And so you can see by municipality on the Virginia Peninsula where we lie. And so again, not including the federal data, we're just under 54% of those 12 and above, with varying numbers based on the municipality. But when you add in what we believe is an appropriate surrogate for the federal data based on census and based on the military population per municipality, that number actually goes up to 66.7%. And again, this is 12 and older, not 18 and above, which is what I discussed on the last slide. And again, you can see by municipality how we're doing. So this has been the type of scorecard that this local community collaboratives we've been looking at this type of data over the last 2 months, 3 times a week, in order to inform our decisions around where we need to focus our vaccination efforts. And that effort has changed over time. You know, we've gone from large mass clinics, as many of you may be aware of, including one very successful clinic that was held for a number of months at Christopher Newport University. We're now seeing that the larger efforts are not really getting us where we need to be, that individuals that were willing to come and get vaccinated in that type of arena or large venue scenario has shifted, and we're now really focused on much more onto community outreach, such as going you know, to local churches, going to local schools to immunize the students, going into underserved communities. In fact, we'll be doing a vaccine clinic tomorrow at the Boo Williams Sports Complex. So we're really trying to do much more focused community events at this point to get to those that may not have yet had an opportunity to get vaccinated, and also to educate on the importance of vaccination. The other thing that I wanted to share was some information on those 65 and above, and I think, you know, we're all aware that the statistics around severity of illness for those that are 65 and above, you know, it's much more significant, the risk of hospitalization, the risk of severe illness, and 65 and above were some of the first populations that had access to the vaccine once we got through phase 1A, which were frontline essential workers such as hospital and healthcare employees. And so as you look at the region, we're actually doing quite well in the more senior populations. We're at 93%, and again, you can see the numbers. I will call out a data anomaly around Williamsburg because we were at 102%. But you know, part of this is just the mismatch. We have to go off the most recent census data, and there may be individuals that claim their city of residence, and it just doesn't quite match with the most recent census data. But I think generally we're doing quite well with the vaccination rates in our older population, which is our highest at risk. But I also wanted to point out that we do have disparities in vaccination at this point, and you can see based on race how we're doing by city, and we do know that some of the ethnic groups are lagging behind the wider Caucasian, and so again, this is one of the areas where we are putting heavy focus through the community collaborative to make sure that we are providing access, that we are providing education, that we're doing it in a way that meets any language or other needs, and that is an ongoing effort and something that we continue to focus on week to week as we continue to support the vaccination of this region. So I want to spend a couple minutes talking about variants because we know there's a lot of information right now around variants. So there's different ways that the CDC looks at variants, and this was actually established back, this was established in collaboration with the SARS-CoV-2 interagency group. And so there's variants of interest, variants of concern, and variants of high consequence. So at this point, we don't have any variants that have been classified as high consequence, although the CDC does have an update next Friday where they will be talking about variants, so we'll see if that changes at that point. So the variants to this point have really been put into either a variant of interest or variant of concern, and we're going to really talk about the variants of concern right now, because these are the ones where we're seeing an evidence of increased transmissibility, more severe disease, potentially reduced effectiveness of vaccines. So here is a snapshot of the variants of concern that are really being tracked right now. And, you know, we've got ancestral names, which is sometimes how you will see them referred to if you're looking at a press release or some type of other information. But the WHO is trying to make it a little more understandable. So when we look back to the original strain that came out of China at the beginning of the pandemic, that's considered to be, it is the wild strain, and so that doesn't have a variant name, WHO name, because that is the parent strain, if you will. But then you can start seeing the other strains that I think we've become familiar with over time. So the UK strain is now called the alpha strain, you know, South Africa beta, etc. So when you look at what's going on this week related to COVID, I think you've probably seen in the media a lot of concern around the Delta strain. The Delta strain is the strain that is coming out of India. And what is really striking about this strain at this point is that there's been just a much greater transmissibility, and there seems to be much greater worldwide spread in a short period of time. In fact, the UK announced yesterday that the Delta strain is now responsible for 91% of all new cases in the UK. That's up from just 66% when I was doing research earlier this week. And so it's a very rapidly moving target with this Delta strain. The US, as of the last report that I saw, the Delta strain now is responsible for about 6%. But what I do have in the right-hand column, just because you know, we're talking about our region, is right now it is less than 2% for Delta, but we are starting to see an increase. So it is something that we're certainly keeping an eye on. The majority of the cases in our region right now are attributable to the beta or to the alpha strain, which is the strain that came out of the UK. I think that, you know, again, the concern that we have around these strains, especially the ones that are highlighted in peach, is that they're also seeing spread through reinfection of recovered patients and partially vaccinated patients. And we'll talk in a minute around vaccine efficacy, but that clearly is a concern, as we're not quite at our goal of where we want to be from a herd immunity perspective. So here's a slide, and again, this is a few weeks old at this point, but it's from a CDC presentation of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the ACIP. Again, they meet next Friday, so I'm guessing this information will be updated at that point. But this at the time was really looking at not the Delta variant, because they didn't have any data at that point on the Delta variant, but I'll talk about the data we do have in just a minute. But you can see for the UK variant, which right now is the predominant variant in this area, and that's the B.1.1.7, in some post-emergency use authorization studies, Pfizer has actually held up quite well. So 90% against that strain in a study that was done in the Middle East, and 100% for severe and critical disease. So good news on that front. I don't have data on Moderna. They did not share that. More recently with the Delta variant, they are seeing with 2 doses of Pfizer that there's still strong efficacy above 80%. Where the problem is lying is with a single dose of Pfizer, that drops to roughly 33%. So really important that we focus on getting that second dose of Pfizer in, especially with the emergence of these variants, and specifically the Delta variant. And then I want to spend just the last couple of minutes, and then we'll go to any questions that we've got in the box, on what's going on for the future. So there's a number of ongoing clinical trials, as well as ongoing safety surveillance monitoring. So some of the clinical trials that are ongoing, they are looking at children 6 months to 12 years. There was actually an all-day meeting yesterday of the FDA Advisory Committee talking about the level of evidence and the risk-benefit of vaccines generally in those 6 months to 12 years to help inform, when they do have data, how they will approve the vaccine. So there's going to be a lot more coming in that area, and more than likely we'll see movement of those that are 6 to 11, and then 6 months to 6 essentially will be a later phase. There's also ongoing clinical trials in pregnant women, cancer patients, MS, rheumatic diseases, organ transplant, and dialysis patients. And many of these trials are because, especially in MS, cancer, et cetera, there is concern that those individuals may not be able to elicit the same antibody response to the vaccine. And so they're doing some more targeted studies in those populations, and that information, much like the ongoing safety data, will continue to evolve and be reported and inform decisions for where we go forward with our vaccine development. And then I think the other hot topic that we get a lot of questions about is what's happening with boosters, because I think we've all seen over the last few months that more than likely we're going to need to get some type of booster dose. We don't quite know when that will be. We don't quite know at what frequency that will be. Will it be like the flu vaccine where we'll need to get something annually? But there's a number of clinical trials that are ongoing. Some of the study designs include a booster dose of the same formulation. So if you got Pfizer for your first 2 doses, you would essentially just get a 3rd dose, same formulation at some defined time period. And right now they're what you're hearing is 12, somewhere between 9 and 12 months. Although again, at the ACIP meeting next Friday, they're going to be talking about some of the data on booster doses, so we may have better information at that point. They're also looking at studies with your 3rd dose would be from the same manufacturer, but it would be a slightly different formulation that's been re-engineered, if you will, to attempt to counteract some of the variants. And so that is ongoing. There's also a study that was just released or announced by National Institutes of Health last week, where they're looking at a small group of individuals where they're giving you your booster from a different manufacturer. So if you got Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson for your first dose or doses, you would get Moderna for your booster. And then they're also looking at the impact of administering booster doses with other vaccines, not meaning that they're mixed together yet, because the vaccines have different mechanisms and they're derived in different ways. But Pfizer just launched a study within the last week that's looking at giving a COVID vaccine booster along with a pneumococcal vaccine. And really they're looking to see if there's any impact on either of the vaccines, but they're also hoping that being able to put vaccines together like that might increase vaccine compliance generally in adults that may be going in to get, say you're going in to get your COVID booster, but you're also due for your pneumococcal. Would that incentivize or help us get to a better place with vaccination rates generally? And then lastly, there's some early trials around oral formulations. So again, many things that go into clinical trials as far as development of drugs may never see the light of day, but the clinical trials around the various specific patient types, such as cancer patients, as well as those in younger populations and booster doses, are obviously things that we'll be looking for the outcome of those over the next weeks and months to come, because that will inform our decisions about where we're going from a COVID perspective. So at this point, we will go to questions, and I've got one question in the box so far, and it says the goal for July 4th is 70% of people receiving at least 1 dose. I hear people who have had COVID-19 have some immunity. Is this group considered at all in the studies? And I think that's a really good question, because we do know that individuals that have had active COVID-19 disease do develop antibodies. There are ongoing studies to follow some of those individuals to try to understand how long do those antibodies last. I think one of the things that we've clearly seen in some of the, I don't even say just clinical studies, and some personal accounts that I've heard, is that probably much like the vaccine, but maybe more variable with the disease, is that the antibody that you develop may be very different between individuals that got infected with the same strain. One of them may, have a large number of antibodies that they've developed, and another may have almost none. So I think there's probably more variability in knowing. I think the challenge is, and I think it's an interesting question, because if you look at any segment of the population, if we're 70% have been immunized, well, what portion of those not immunized had active COVID disease and when? Because they will have some level of immunity, maybe not as predictable, but right now that is not being, it's not being considered in the 70% goal, but I'm guessing it's being looked at from when will we reach herd immunity, because herd immunity is really going to be that combination of those that have decided to get vaccinated and those who may have developed antibodies on their own because of active COVID-19. So not a perfect answer, but I do know that there are, it's being considered, and certainly there are individuals being followed that have had active disease to see where their antibodies are. So if there's any other questions, we would love to have you put them in the chat feature, and we'll try our best to answer those questions. Well, seeing none, I want to thank you for attending today. I hope the information was informative, and have a great weekend.